2011 was a year of extremes and a polarizing one at that. In this age of social media and connectivity, everyone was busy building a shell around themselves, making sure that only what agreed with them was visible to them. This would turn out to have some really bad consequences down the line, and you could see the first signs already if you looked carefully. All would happen just as Metal Gear Solid 2 said it would, but not a lot of people were paying attention. News that the perpetrator of the September 11th attacks was finally found and killed grabbed a lot of attention, but for the most part, people were too busy reeling from disasters like the one that hit Japan. An earthquake of magnitude 9 occurred off the coast, causing a giant 40-meter-tall tsunami alongside smaller, still giant waves to smash into the southeastern part of the country. This event killed more than 15,000 people and caused hundreds of billions in damage. But most of all, the wave destroyed the safety measures put in place to prevent a meltdown at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. There was a meltdown. It became the biggest nuclear disaster since Chernobyl, leading to a massive radiation leak, a large area of contamination, and years of cleanup needed. And when it wasn't a natural disaster bringing horror to people, it was the actions of man itself. Public shootings reached an alarming new record in brazenness. Children were being targeted, both in the United States and in Norway. Hope was fading for many. People were enraged, they were discontent, they were fed up with everything that had happened in the past few years. And some of them began to manifest this through riots like the ones in England that included a lot of looting and burning things, or more peaceful but mass protests like the one that would be called Occupy Wall Street, a movement that at first aimed to force the end of the financial sector's influence on politics following the 2008 crash of the economy, for which no one had yet been punished. It tried to stop the control of the 1% of the other 99%. As the months went on, the movement started drifting into different directions, becoming an incubator for selectivism culture, the social justice culture, and the idea that you don't actually have to accomplish anything as long as you scream loud enough and for long enough on social media. But that very social media was being used by other people throughout Northern Africa and the Middle East, by people that seemed to be very upset with their governments, leading to the Arab Spring, an event that in some places brought change for the better, removing certain restrictions, giving some people freedom they had yearned for many years, and in some cases, it brought unending civil war, grief, and a human disaster with consequences that we are still feeling now. That spirit of change, of wishing a new order, was in many places throughout 2011, even in Romania. It didn't work here. Nothing ever does. This whole affair was sort of prophesied by Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri 12 years before, and its prophecies about the impact of the flow of information on society would continue to ring true. And more dissolution would follow that year. Space Shuttle Discovery flew for the last time, ending the program forever. To this day, there is still no replacement for it. And even though billionaires may promise stars, currently we bow our heads to the ground and try to explore space and Kerbal Space Program instead, a small little game released while still very much in early development by a small studio named Squad. It was a game built to be educational by trying to be accurate, and then its small niche of building/exploration games with a high degree of realism, it would become a giant, a force for good, giving hope to people that were so disillusioned with the progress of space travel that they would soon begin to believe that the world is flat. Kerbal Space Program was not a game to polarize people, but there were quite a few of them in 2011. Take Duke Nukem Forever, for example, a game that everyone will tell you was a total disaster, a misguided attempt to continue the development of a cancelled and badly managed project that was being worked on for more than a decade. The result was a horrible, terrible mess of a game, but not according to the developer, Gearbox, that proceeded to not just ignore criticism but downright reject it and placing the blame on people having the wrong expectations or on the game not being fairly reviewed. A bit of the opposite happened with Dragon Age 2, a game marketed heavily to spin the negative aspects of a rushed game, like recycled content, in a positive way. A game that toned down much of what made the previous title great, in hope of making it more action-oriented and therefore find a new crowd of people that will enjoy it. The reaction from the fans was not all that positive, and yet parts of the media were giving it scores of 10 out of 10, further cementing the idea that the gaming media didn't really have the interests of the gamers at heart. Instead, it was more concerned with catering to sponsors, which were represented mostly by the publishers whose games were being reviewed. This idea had been festering for many years. It did not come out of nowhere. I may have glossed over some of the incidents in the past years, like GameSpot editor Jeff Gerstmann being fired for giving a too low a score to Kane Lynch, but rest assured, there were a lot of incidents, and there would be many more in the coming years. The traditional gaming media was losing its footing, especially because of the financial troubles around the world. Selling out was a way to stay in business. It absolutely was. And it was a far better way to seal its own fate. They were no longer the gatekeepers. Now anyone could start a gaming site. It was so simple, so easy. But more importantly, now there was video. YouTube especially began to explode with gaming content, game reviews, in-depth analysis videos that some people would spend months working on. And while many had a, well, let's say variable level of quality, the top ones were exceeding anything that the traditional media was able to create. And it did so without any of the baggage, the limitations or the sins of traditional gaming media. But of course, the most popular video game content creators would be the reaction camera screamers that would yell and make funny faces and thumbnails in order to attract their main audience, 10-year-olds, unsupervised, and possibly not all that well cared for by their parents. This tendency would extend to video game content streaming as well, through a newly established service named Twitch TV, and it would dominate soon. The screamers, the reaction cameras, the endless spam with no substance, no motive, no reason, simply noise, like dangling keys in front of a toddler, and they would make millions and millions of dollars from it. And so would rise the influencers, and any hope that YouTube would have a better influence on the gaming audience than the media had turned to ash. But back to actual games for a moment. 2011 gave us Skyrim, the most successful game of the Elder Scrolls series to date, partly because it continued the trend of its predecessor of diluting the gameplay, simplifying it, reducing options, and removing choices. But it was still a fun romp through Tamriel. Fun enough to sell millions upon millions of copies, to become what a generation identified with the Elder Scrolls, with RPGs in general, with games. And then it would be remastered, resold, and ported to every platform imaginable over the next decade, to the ire of people tired of a joke about being shot in the leg with a bow and arrow. But at least it managed to not pander to the new trend of entertainment in in general, that of shoving zombies at every turn, though technically it did have zombies, but they were in universe, there was a reason for them. But for those who did want zombies, well, they were everywhere. You would have games like Dead Island. You'd even have smaller games like the still in development Project Zomboid or No More Room in Hell. Things would get very crowded on the zombie front for quite some time. They would also get crowded on the "this looks like Game of Thrones" front, because the new hit show inspired a lot of copycats and adaptations in terms of style quite quickly. Even The Sims got in on the act with The Sims Medieval, even though Electronic Arts would release an official Game of Thrones themed expansion for The Sims 3 instead, possibly out of confusion, or possibly because a Sims game that had more gameplay than incentives to buy DLC was not as popular of a choice as The Sims 3 for such a DLC. Some companies, however, tried, or at least were trying to shy away from the trends they used to chase. Saints Row 3 became even less of a GTA clone by billing itself as a crazy game where crazy things will happen, and somewhere in there you may steal a car or two, possibly. People disappointed by the constant watering down of games would soon be greeted by Dark Souls, a continuation of the idea of Demon Souls and Severance the Blade of Darkness before it, but within its own universe and with its own particularities, like a horribly broken physics component. Though truthfully that was a staple of the franchise since the get-go, but it would be a game much celebrated by a lot of people, and with a lot of influence on the industry in the future. It carved out its own niche that turned out to be bigger than anyone expected, leading many to try and copy it directly, or at least implement some of its ideas, or that of its predecessor. One such game would be The Witcher 2, inspired in gameplay more by Demon Souls than by the first Witcher. Assassins of Kings was released to the delight of fans of the original and disappointment as well. Somehow, a developer that had only created PC games up until now succeeded at creating a port of an Xbox game for the PC even before making the Xbox version of the game. Such a thing was impossible, and yet there it was. Fixing it would take time, but CD Projekt committed to it and eventually did, rebuilding parts of the game completely and doing it all for free, repaying again the devotion of the people that bought the game. And CD Projekt Red would not be the only developer that would make such a commitment. It was rare, but for a brief moment, it seemed that the AAA sector understood that it's okay to show support for the people that bought your games. Deus Ex Human Revolution was an astonishingly good game considering when it was made, the directions that mainstream RPGs were going, and what happened to the previous Deus Ex. And yet it did have its own problems that would be addressed in a remade version sometime later. One that was not free, but extremely cheap for anybody that had the game. Sure, compared to the first Deus Ex, it would still be a lesser game. Pretty much anything is. But the effort was appreciated. And speaking of effort, LA Noire came out this year, a police investigation game with excellent facial animations and made by studio Team Bondi, with a management so horrible that it churned through employees in the hundreds over the course of 7 years of working sometimes 12 hours a day. The practice would be lambasted and condemned by the press and by different organizations in the industry, but almost a decade later it would still be the norm at big studios. After all, it was still the age of go big or go home. Well, not entirely. It was around this point that the indie revolution started to, well, I wouldn't say take root, but blossom with massively successful, excellent games. Games like Supergiant's Bastion, an action title set on a very creative post-apocalyptic world with excellent style and the narrator for most of your actions. The Stanley Parable, a simple mod at the time, not a full-fledged game, had a similar idea, but it wasn't an action game, instead being something far more experimental and surreal. Magicka wasn't exactly indie being published by Paradox, but considering the budget that Arrowhead Games had and the pull that Paradox would have as a publisher, you may as well call it an indie game. A very buggy one and to this day barely functioning, but one that was jam-packed with humor and magnificent magic-based combat. Akron was a game that tried to push the RTS genre, which by now had sort of dwindled down to StarCraft 2 and not much else, to a new level by introducing time traveling with time ripples that let you affect events in the past and in the future, or the present at least. And while the idea itself was magnificent, the RTS part wasn't really all that great, so it's mostly forgotten now. Terraria latched on to the Minecraft craze by giving you a similar experience but in 2D and with bosses. Gemini Rue made for a very entertaining cyberpunk space adventure about assassins, secretive corporations, and what it means to be yourself. And even some bigger publishers were catching on to the idea that maybe it's okay to release games that don't have a budget of $10 million at a minimum. And so Ubisoft brought us an inexplicably poorly running god game in the form of Dust and the best 2D platformer of its age, the beautiful Rayman Origins. But what really set the stage for people realizing that maybe pouring all the money into a game was a bad idea when you could have poured some of the money and then actually tried to make a good game was Star Wars: The Old Republic, a game that was released with much anticipation and a lot of marketing, having behind it a reported budget of around $200 million, and the Star Wars brand itself. Even so, it failed to meet sales and subscriber expectations. Not even the shutdown of the once more ambitious Star Wars Galaxies would help, since for the most part, The Old Republic was a story-driven World of Warcraft clone with a Star Wars skin slapped onto it. Even Star Trek Online was far more original, bolder, and more interesting. In order to avoid a shutdown, it would go free to play within a year. By 2013, The Old Republic had yet to recoup its reported budget. It probably has done so thanks to all those microtransactions by now. I could probably call this rampant example of hubris and budget creep the game of 2011, since it was symbolic of a disease within the games industry, or LA Noire in its forced dead march to release, or Duke Nukem Forever's disaster, or Crysis 2's abandonment of everything that made the first one good in a futile attempt to chase console success that led to turning a once great original game into a lackluster Halo clone, or Deus Ex Human Revolution as a way to show that there was a way to actually make a good game from an old series. Heck, Mortal Kombat made a magnificent comeback by rebooting a fighting game series with a focus on story that went beyond what anyone expected it to ever be. And Portal 2 managed to be a fantastic sequel to a game that many would have called perfect a few years before, though some would say that it was a needless sequel. It was, after all, a very polarizing time. Lines were being drawn. It was time for people to start picking sides, and the world would be worse for it. But no, the game of 2011 was Minecraft. It reached version 1.0 this year. It had sold millions upon millions of copies, pretty much doubling every year, not even doubling. From 2010 to 2011 it increased eightfold, and then it would just keep on going. And it's not just because of all the money, it created new trends, I would say, new things that people wanted or wanted other games to be like. The survival game trend, which people would latch onto for the next few years, came from this. The building game craze, to which people would latch onto and even shove into existing franchises like Fallout, started because of Minecraft. The graphics are giant cubes trend that every Indian small budget game seemed to love came from here, and with time, Minecraft would even bring about the Battle Royale craze. Minecraft was played by a lot of children because it was so approachable. Parents could let them play it and not come back and see them do something unspeakable like in GTA. And because of this, it is the driving creative force behind what will be the game developers of the future. Well, until Fortnite came along, but we'll get to that in December. And naturally, because it was played by so many children, it was hated by a lot of people that still want to pretend that they're cool, and because they don't like Minecraft, they're adults and edgy and hip with it, and they'll only play something if it has a brown filter on it because that's realistic and rad. And of course, Minecraft did start the careers of many YouTube celebrities, mostly for the worse. But most of all, the giant success of Minecraft with no marketing, no promotion, no boxed version, no support from any store, no support from any publisher, with nothing but the support of the people that wanted to play it. In spite of the primitive shape it was in for many years before release, was the nail in the coffin for the control over the video games industry of the big publishers, the retail stores, and the traditional games media. It was everyone's game now, as the saying goes, and the consequences would be evident quite soon. So ends another year. Come back next time when we will see the apocalypse. Or maybe not. Probably not. Goodbye.